Thank you very much. It's been a long day and I've had a very long one. I'm sure some of you have as well. So I noticed a very generous time allocation for me to speak this evening. You'll be relieved to know I may not use all of it. So then we'll have more time for questions and answers and discussion, which is always good. All right. Well, is that going to get us to the right one? That one will. Okay. What are we talking about? So let's just have a brief recap on what the project is that's brought us all here. So it's the Western Harbour Tunnel and the Beaches Link. The Western Harbour Tunnel is in the blue section. There are apologies if you can't see this too well, but I imagine you'd be fairly familiar with this. It's 3 lanes in each direction. It's a tunnel that goes under the harbour and it comes up in North Sydney, and then it can continue, or vehicles using that route could continue onto the northern beaches via that yellow section, which is the Beaches Tunnel, which I gather is also 3 lanes in each direction. Now, in order to, I think, understand what the rationale is, what the strategic rationale is, we need to look at how this motorway is connected to a lot of other motorways in Sydney, and in particular, how it's connected to this motorway here. So this is the WestConnex project. Briefly, it's a project that has 3 parts or 3 stages. The M4, Stage 1, which is in that green section, so that's an existing motorway. As Noel said, it was an extension of that, and it's attempting to join that motorway up to other motorway networks that are in the inner city area around the Anzac Bridge. So even though the Anzac Bridge is currently operating at capacity, so what we're basically doing is connecting that motorway up to another motorway section that really doesn't have any capacity to take any more traffic. Okay, so that's something that we're doing. The next stage, stage 2, is the M5, and that's in that lighter coloured blue. So that's a motorway that has already been built as well. It's at capacity, and a lot of the roads in and around that inner area around the airport and General Holmes Drive and the tunnel that goes under the airport runways that you'd be familiar with, that section of road is operating at capacity as well. And I'm going to show you what I mean by a road operating at capacity. Then there's this darker blue section, which is in the middle. This is a new road, a new motorway, so it's not increasing the capacity of an existing motorway, but it's a new tunnel. And it's meant to join or provide a link between the M4 and the M5. And what I want to highlight now is, well, there's 2 things I want to highlight. It's what happens there at that red spot there, because that is where that motorway then connects with the Western Harbour Tunnel. All right, so this motorway configuration and what goes on here is very much linked to what happens with the Western Harbour Tunnel and the Beaches Link through this area. So you've got to think of the 2 together. There was another point I wanted to make about that. Yes, what I will do a bit later on down in the presentation is I'm going to show you something about the traffic volumes that are projected for this motorway, for WestConnex. And the point that I'm going to make, and it's a very critical point, is that where that dark blue section is, the traffic that is projected for that section of the motorway is actually way below the capacity of that tunnel. So that tunnel has 4 lanes in each direction, so it's an 8-lane tunnel in total. And what I'm going to show you is that the volumes that are expected by the motorway proponents are actually a lot lower than what that tunnel can accommodate. So we have an example of that in Sydney. It's called the Cross City Tunnel, and the Cross City Tunnel has very low traffic volumes on it, and there are particular reasons for that. And what I'm going to get to is that we're looking at another example of that with WestConnex Stage 3. And the reason why the Western Harbour Tunnel and the Beaches Link has come up is because they are looking for ways in which to try and increase the amount of traffic that will be inside the WestConnex Stage 3 in order to justify that as a tollway that will make money for a private tollway company. Now that's a very cynical sounding way of putting it. I'd like to now make something that I was going to do. I'm going to make a little bit of an effort now to show you that I'm not a cynical person. I'm actually a very optimistic person. So before I tell you the rest of this story, briefly, my background is I'm a strategic transport planner, so I look at the big picture and I look at the justification for motorway and public transport projects in terms of what they're going to do for a whole area or a whole region. Yes, I look at details, but I don't just focus on those. I am a bit of a fan of Gladys Berejiklian, which might surprise some people. As a Transport Minister, Gladys Berejiklian brought in reforms for our public transport network that was sorely needed, and they have had a very positive effect on the network. Our network is much better than it used to be. I'm not prepared to say that isn't the case. Things may have lapsed a bit. I think there has been some influence from other people within that political party. They have very different views. But I think that what she did in the early days was it really needed to be commended. I also do consultancy work for Sydney Trains, so I make money, or my university makes money out of the work that I do. So I have an interest, potentially a vested interest, and I should declare that. I have also worked advising groups that have initiated legal proceedings against tollway companies, so I specialise in that. I'm an induced traffic growth specialist. I'm going to show you a bit of that in a moment. Back to this. So that's my story and my background and the position that I come at from this. I would also add that some of my favourite politicians have been Labor Party transport ministers that I got on very well with, even though I didn't like their policies very much. So it's a funny, old, mixed up world that we live in. Back to the motorway. Because at the end, this is what it's all about. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now are some details of that interchange. So this is what the WestConnex interchange in that section is, and my colleague Matt Hounsell produced a drawing that is colour-coded so you can see which bits go where. Now importantly, the red bits are the on-ramps for the Western Harbour Tunnel. Now the point here is if you don't build the Western Harbour Tunnel and the Beaches Link, then you get an interchange that looks more like that. Now one of the problems at the moment is that lots of folks, and I am not a construction expert, but my understanding is that there are lots of difficulties with this configuration. Because some of these, like the cloverleaf sections for example, they're as much as 60 metres below ground. Right, this is a very complicated intersection to have underground. And I don't believe, I'm not familiar with terribly many configurations that are like this. So this is the reason why WestConnex Stage 3 was broken up into Stage 3A and 3B. 3A is this, and the mainline tunnel, which is in orange. But the B section is the bit that they're having trouble with, and that's that interchange. Now the point I want to get to tonight is I want to put forward the argument that from a strategic perspective, building the Western Harbour Tunnel and the Beaches Link motorway in order to generate more traffic to make this motorway a viable tollway proposition is not a good raison d'etre for building a motorway. And I'm also going to suggest to you that the amount of traffic that we would be likely to see on the Western Harbour Tunnel and Beaches Link motorway, I'm not convinced that that is of a sufficiently high volume to justify it. I also believe very strongly that this region needs a comprehensive public transport network. And what it needs, most of all, is a very strong public transport, either a high-capacity train or some other mass transit line to act as the spine of that alternative, with a comprehensive set of public transport feeder routes. And there are very particular reasons for why I think that. I also think that in order, if your view is, as a community, that you'd like to stop that motorway, the first thing that needs to be stopped is this red section here. And the government has not said yes to this as yet. There's been no contract signed for it. And I think that's very important. So let's keep that in mind. But what I'll do,
Michelle,
am I bad to the bone?
Can you just orient us to the suburbs there?
Sorry, I'm very sorry about that.
So
okay.
Is that Balmain?
That's Balmain.
Okay.
All right, let's go back to this one here. So where that red circle is, that's the part of Sydney that we're talking about. So that's the launch pad for the Western Harbour Tunnel, and it's under Balmain and Rozelle. Okay, I haven't got a pointy laser thing, unfortunately. I left it back at the office. Just to the east of that is the Anzac Bridge. All right, it's down a bit lower, but it's within that circle there. So that's what goes into the CBD. Some of it remains on the surface, and some of it goes underneath in the Cross City Tunnel. Picking up on a quick point that Noel made, there's always been problems with the linkages between the M4 and that other section. Some people like myself are of the view that yes, we did need to do something about connecting that, but we needed to connect it in order to facilitate heavy vehicle movements so that they could use motorway sections that had already been built, like the Cross City Tunnel, that could then get us down into this other airport here. But they're very slight and very minor. It's nothing like the huge constructions that we're seeing with WestConnex. Okay, I'm getting diverted. So let's go back here. So is that, you're with me now? Okay. All right. This is a diagram of something called the County of Cumberland scheme, and this is what our motorways were all based on, including the motorway that was being proposed for this area. They were originally proposed back in 1948, and they became part of a legislative plan in about 1952. The key feature is that they are all radial motorways that focus like spokes on a wheel into the centre of the city. And what folks didn't know back then was that when you build motorway networks like this, you do two things. You generate additional traffic just by building those roads. You don't, and it's not necessarily traffic that was there before the roads were built. And the other thing too is that from a congestion perspective, it's disastrous to go and funnel a whole lot of roads in at one point. It's never going to work. It seems very obvious now, but back in those days it didn't. And one of the reasons why it wasn't is because there were a lot of people using public transport. And so the whole city seemed different. So by putting a road network like this in, people actually thought, oh yes. All I need now is a beer and a cigarette. And I'll be fine. All right. Use this on some of my students. Okay, so you can see they're all coming in like spokes on a wheel, but this area around here, it was never going to fare very well because you're funneling all of that traffic into the same area and you just physically can't fit it all in. This is the more contemporary version of that concept. So this is our radials here. That's the M5, the M4, and the M2. There is a motorway corridor that was proposed here, and then also the F6. Now I'm from the Shire, so I'm on the other end of this radial down here, and what we're confronted with down in the Shire is very similar to what folks up here on I think it's the Insular Peninsula, that's the rude name that people call you, they call us rude names down in the Shire as well. But we're very good at stopping motorways getting built down in the Shire. We're quite proud of that. We're hoping to stop the same one again. So these are the versions that are all going in here. And what I want to show you now is just very quick. This is what we're seeing now in the centre's strategy. This is the previous version, and you'll notice it here, they're highlighting Brookvale DY and the Beaches Precinct as strategic centres. That's what those rings mean. And in this view, they're not connected to anything. And that's a big problem, because it means as centres, they're not being supported and they're not going to grow or develop. That might be a better way of putting it. They're not going to become more complex and more diverse in the way that we want them to. Here's another diagram which I think is quite critical. So this showed that what they were wanting to do is to bring these centres into the fold of what's going on through here. And so they wanted to investigate mass transit links of some kind between these areas and these areas here. Now, as far as I know, we're yet to really see that serious consideration take place. They also have been talking about better transit links through here, and the current improvements to the bus services, I think that's a good start, but I don't think that anyone should consider that to be a good end. There needs to be a lot more done. There's a lot more to do. So in order to support these centres here, and I'll come back to this later, one of the things that needs to happen is that these centres need to be connected via some kind of mass transit link. So strategically, for these to really thrive, there needs to be links through here, and yes, there needs to be links that go down into the CBD, but they can sort of be done via that alignment as well. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to be redone there, and I think that as a community, you've been denied that opportunity to have that discussion and that debate. Would you like a train line or a mass transit line that would improve the diversity and access to those centres, or do you just want more motorway development along the radial model? Okay, so I'm now going to try and, that's the broad picture strategic implications. What I'm going to do now is run through a few transport operational principles that I'm going to try and convince you of, and I'm going to try and do it in a way that is as plain language as possible. So at this point, if I was with students, I'd be putting a whole lot of formulas and graphs and things up on the slide deck, but I'm not going to do that. So the first thing I want to point out is that traffic congestion, or the speed of the road, is determined by the speed of the public transport network. Really important principle. So the public transport network is what we call a fixed speed network. It operates to a schedule. Okay? Road networks operate to a variable speed. The speed varies because the numbers of vehicles on the road determine what the speed is. If there's lots of vehicles on the road, you go slower. If there's fewer vehicles on the road, you go faster because there's less congestion. All right? Now, most people will go for whichever option is the quickest. They don't care which mode it is. And so if the fixed speed network is faster, and lots of people will then jump on that, and so the number of people on the road goes down and the speed goes up. And what happens in cities when we look at them is that when the public transport network speeds increase, the road traffic congestion levels, or the road speeds, increase as well. When we slow down the rail network, as we did in Sydney, then what often happens is that the road speeds will drop as well. So the road speeds follow the public transport speeds. In this sector here, you don't have a strong public transport network, and that's why you've got a traffic congestion problem, or a road traffic congestion problem. Okay. Just to back that up, here's an example of one of the underlying things that drives a lot of people's transport choices. So this is Victoria Park from the air. What I want to highlight is its walking network, its walking path network, which is there, and then you've got these informal networks here. So this is what's going on. You can see those girls in the middle. Well, these are the formal paths. This is not, and those girls are there walking along a goat path. The reason why I'm showing you that is because you can see here that when given the option, people will always go for the quickest option. And what people are doing here, and you've done this yourself, and I've done it too, and that is that we shortcut and we make our own path. So when looking at transport generally, this same principle, people taking whichever option is quickest, drives a lot of the traffic patterns that are going on in the network. This is a very simple example that we can all hopefully relate to. When we run traffic models, this is something that we're constantly computing in those traffic models as well. So this is a very simple explanation of that. So when we go back to this one here, this point here about public transport networks determining the, or public transport speeds determining the road speeds, it's because of a more elaborate version of those relationships that play out in transport networks that becomes responsible for that. Okay, so I want to try and give you that as much as I'm able to, so that you can, it's a very important strategic point there. All right, now what happens when we build motorways? Given that point I've just made, I'm going to show you what happened before and after the M4 motorway section, a section in the M4 was built. So we're talking about this section here, which is at Mayshilda Prospect, and this was opened in 1992. It's a while ago now, it seems like yesterday to me. But basically what happened was, is that the road traffic volumes here in red, which are the ones on the M4, you can see that they jumped up at the time when the motorway was opened, when that section was built. The road traffic volumes on the parallel road, the Great Western Highway, which are there in light grey, they drop slightly. Okay, and you'd expect that. People go from the slower route to the faster route. Right, we're seeing that principle play out again. But here's the catch. When we add these two together, as we've done here, we get this little blip up here. Here's the question. What is it that made that additional traffic of about 20,000 vehicle movements per day? Where the hell did that come from? All right, so it comes from a number of different places, and I don't have more slides on this, but generally speaking, there were other roads further out from these main roads here, so there was more traffic reassignment, as we call it. There was also people who came off the parallel public transport road link, or the rail link. So the rail numbers dropped as well. In short, what happens though is that there's about 11,000 additional movements on average per day through that corridor that we can't account for in terms of there being of them coming from other sources. So people were also just making new trips, additional trips. Now this outcome is what we see every time a new motorway is built. We see additional trips being generated. So this is one of the reasons why motorways don't always reduce traffic congestion. Because what happens is that people will then just refill to the congestion levels that the road was operating at previously. Here's another example that's much closer to home for all of you. So this is the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And these are traffic volumes at a point that's right in the centre of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And this shows traffic volumes before and after the Sydney Harbour Tunnel was opened. All right? So what we can see here is that traffic is growing for a while, and then it reaches this point here. So this is where the road's reached its ceiling capacity. And the traffic volumes just sit there. They don't go anywhere, they just sit on that volume. And the reason why is because the peak periods are full, and not many people want to use a road at 2 in the morning. So that those volumes stay about the same. So what happens during the peak period has a very important impact on what happens in other time periods during the day. But it just sits there. And there is a formula that we use in order to calculate what that number is. We know how to calculate it. It's one of the best known things that there is in traffic engineering. And that's an important point. But once again, we can see here a bit of a blip going up. We know that there were people that came off the public transport lines that cross the Harbour Bridge when the Harbour Tunnel was built. So there's those sorts of things going on. When you make one route quicker, then you're going to attract people onto that route. Okay, so we might skip this. So we've covered those points, I think, and that. Right, what I want to do now is just show you very quickly what's going on at this point with WestConnex Stage 3. Given what we went over previously, I'm going to talk about what the sealing capacity is in the mainline tunnel here. Okay, so without going into the formula, basically during peak hour, the maximum number of vehicles that you can get on one lane of motorway is I'm getting a bit tired now. Is 2,000 vehicles per hour. Okay, so this tunnel here has 4 lanes in each direction. So that means you can get a maximum of 8,000 vehicles per hour in each direction. All right. So what I want to show you is just one page from all of the environmental impact statements for all the work in the WestConnex EISs. And it took me a long time to find this. It's a document that's thousands of pages long. But if we look at the volumes in the mainline tunnel without the Western Harbour tunnel, then we get volumes that are about 1/3 of the capacity of that tunnel. So the capacity is 8,000 vehicles in each direction. 10 years after opening, they're expecting to see volumes in the order of under 6,000 vehicles per, I think this is per hour in both directions. So that's 6,000, under 6,000 vehicles for a tunnel that has the capacity in both directions of 16,000. Okay, so what that means is that these volumes here are much lower than what that tunnel could take. So my question would be, why build 4 lanes in each direction? Why not build 2? Because that would be more than enough to carry the volumes that you are anticipating would be using that tunnel 10 years after it's opened. If you build the Western Harbour tunnel, then these volumes go up. And I think that that's the raison d'etre for why the Western Harbour tunnel is being proposed. That's a key point. In order to justify what has been proposed for WestConnex, you need to induce some traffic growth and you need to redirect traffic into that tunnel. So that's what's going on there. And a lot of these volumes here are actually, it's traffic that is currently using the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Harbour Tunnel. So it's already got some road space there, but they're trying to pull it off those existing roads in order to get these up to levels that would make them more attractive in terms of tolls. So that's quite a critical point. Okay, I'll skip to this one. If we now look at some modelling for your area, so this is the Spit and Military roads through here. This one is Warringah Road and Mona Vale Road. So what we did was we had one of our modellers take the model, the base model that is used by the RMS, it's the same model, and go and have a look at, well, what sort of traffic is currently using these 3 roads, which are the ones that would presumably we draw a lot of the traffic off these 3 roads and they would then go into the Beaches Link and the Western Harbour Tunnel. All right, that's one of the arguments. So if we build the motorway, then we'll take traffic off local roads or these arterials here, and that will make things better on the surface. Like, that's a very familiar argument. The reason why people think that would happen is because the motorway would be quicker than these existing roads. Yep, so it goes back to that principle I showed earlier, and then that would free up a lot of road space. Now, there's a yes and a no to that. When we look at a lot of the traffic that is using those 3 roads, the majority of it is traffic that has its origin, its trip origin and its trip destination on north of the harbour, or in other words, they're local trips. Okay, so the majority of trips, going on these roads here, they're actually local trips. They're not trips that would use the Western Harbour Tunnel or the beaches link, really. Okay, and just as a general comment as well, I'd say this area generally, it doesn't have a huge amount of urban development in it. You might think it does, but if you compare yourselves to the western sector of Sydney, right, what's going on here, as indeed what's going on down south in the Shire, it's peanuts to what's going on out west and in the southwest. They're really big sectors and they generate a lot of traffic that can fill motorways that are 3 and 4 lanes in each direction. Our sectors, no, we don't really do that. We've got a lot of big local roads and yes, they are full of traffic, but I would argue that from a transport perspective or a strategic transport perspective, it's actually difficult to justify building more and bigger roads. Let's have a look at some of the numbers very briefly. So these are the AM or 2-hour AM peak hour volumes. That's what's going on. So Warringah Road is the one that is carrying the most. Mona Vale and the Spit Bridge are carrying similar volumes. So for over the 2-hour period, that's about 20,000 or just over 20,000 vehicle movements in that 2-hour period, or 10,000 vehicle movements across those 3 arterial roads. And this here is the percentage or the component of this that ends up on the other side of the harbour. It's got destinations over on the southern side of the harbour. So if we divide that by 2, that's about, it's just over one lane of motorway traffic operating at full capacity. That's what's currently going over there. So and what's being proposed is to build a tunnel with 3 lanes in each direction. So we're building that in order to accommodate this. Keep in mind that in the off-peaks, the volumes that are using it are smaller than these peak volumes. This is the reason why a strategic transport planner like myself says, you know, maybe you really ought to look at something else. I can't see the justification for this because dirty big motorways are really expensive to build. What I can see some justification for, and now I'll just run you quickly through this. I've gone over time. All right, there's this sector here and this sector here. When we look at the 2 neighbouring regions and we look at who uses public transport and who drives to work, those of us over on the insular peninsula side, we're mostly driving and there's not many of us using public transport. In the other area where they have a rail line, not as many people are driving and more people are using public transport because there's a public transport route there to use. It's not rocket science. When we look at how people are getting to North Sydney, that particular activity centre, once again, those who are living locally, a very big portion are walking and cycling, right? That was, I was surprised at how big that was. But when we look at Pittwater and Warringah, most folks are driving. Those who are living in that area where the rail link is, there's a lot more people using public transport. So if the public transport is there, and if the public transport is fast, people use it. And it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, male or female, old or young, whatever. We tend to go for whichever option is quickest. This is the last slide, I think, or one of the very last. How do we go to Chatswood? Well, once again, those coming from the areas where there are no public transport are driving more than they are in other areas. So in order to bolster these centres over here, we need to find, I think, strategically a way to connect these centres in this part of Sydney more effectively with the rest of the city via better public transport links. I'm not convinced that a motorway development is really the best thing for you, and I think I will end on that point.